Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we delve into the most spine-chilling and mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the forests of Washington State, a region shrouded in natural beauty and legends of Bigfoot. From the terrifying encounter in Olympic Forest to the destructive rampage in Yakama. These 10 stories will make you think twice before venturing into the wilderness. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the shadowy world of Bigfoot encounters. Story number 1. The Roar in Gifford Pinchot. I've always loved camping. There's something primal and comforting about sitting under the stars, surrounded by nature, with nothing but the crackle of a fire and the symphony of the wilderness to keep you company. My boyfriend, Dan, and I had planned our weekend getaway to Gifford Pinchot National Forest for months, excited to escape the noise of the city and immerse ourselves in the stillness of the woods. What we found wasn't stillness, it was terror. We arrived at the forest in the early afternoon, the sun filtering through the towering evergreens and casting long, dappled shadows across the ground. Gifford Pinchot was vast, stretching for miles in every direction, with its dense woods and rugged trails known to attract hikers and adventurers from all over. We'd picked a secluded spot near a clearing, perfect for stargazing. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but we chalked it up to being far from the main camping areas. By the time we set up our tent, the sun was sinking low, and the forest was bathed in an orange glow. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and watched the stars appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. For a while, it was exactly what we'd hoped for. Peaceful, beautiful, perfect. But then came the roar. It started sometime after midnight. I'd been dozing by the fire while Dan fiddled with his camera, trying to capture the night sky. First, I thought it was thunder, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. But as I sat up, I realized it wasn't thunder at all. It was a roar. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud. It echoed through the forest, sending a flock of birds screeching into the night sky. Dan froze, his camera dangling from his neck. What the hell was that? I whispered, my voice trembling. Dan shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. Before we could say anything else, another sound followed, the sharp crack of wood, like a tree snapping in half. It was close, too close. We need to check this out, Dan said, grabbing the flashlight. Are you insane? I hissed. We should stay here, but he was already moving toward the edge of the clearing, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Reluctantly, I followed, my heart pounding. That's when we saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. First, I thought it was a trick of the light, a large tree stump, or some other feature of the forest. But as Dan's flashlight swept across it, the figure moved. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and thick torso covered in dark, matted hair. Its arms hung low at its sides, ending in hands that were far too large, the fingers curling and uncurling like it was testing its grip. But it was the face that froze me in place, part human, part animal, with deep-set eyes that glowed faintly in the light. Its expression was unreadable, but its sheer size and presence radiated a primal, predatory energy. Dan, I whispered, clutching his arm. We need to go. He didn't respond. He was staring at the creature, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam caught its eyes, and for a moment, seemed to squint, as if annoyed by the light. Then it roared again. The sound was deafening, a mix of rage and challenge, so loud I felt it reverberate in my chest. The creature took a step forward, the ground shaking beneath its weight. It bent down, grabbing a branch as thick as my arm and snapping it in half like it was nothing. Run, Dan whispered. We bolted, leaving the fire, the tent, everything behind. The forest blurred around us as we ran, branches whipping at our faces and arms. I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps behind us, the sound of trees snapping and leaves rustling as the creature pursued us. It wasn't running, but its sheer size made every step thunderous. I didn't dare look back. We reached the car, panting and shaking, and threw ourselves inside. Dan fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, before finally starting the engine. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature bursting out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark outline of the forest against the night sky. We drove for hours before stopping at a motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. Neither of us spoke much. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. What the hell was that thing? I finally asked. Dan shook his head, staring blankly at the floor. I don't know, but it wasn't natural. The next morning, against my better judgment, we decided to go back to the campsite. I needed to see if what we'd experienced was real, if the creature had been there, or if it had been some shared hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. When we arrived, the campsite was eerily quiet. The fire had burned down to ashes, and the tent was still standing, though it had been torn open. Our belongings were scattered across the clearing, some of them crushed or broken. And then we saw the footprints. They were massive, far larger than any human or animal could make, pressed deep into the soft earth. Each print was perfectly defined. The toes splayed wide. They led from the edge of the clearing to the tent and back into the forest. The stench lingered, too a pungent, musky odor that made my stomach churn. It was the same smell we'd noticed the night before, thick and cloying, like rotting vegetation and wet fur. Dan picked up a piece of the torn tent, his hands trembling. It was here, he said. It was real. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The evidence was all around us. I've thought about that night every day since. I've read about Gifford Pinchot and the stories of Bigfoot sightings in the area. The reports of roars and broken trees, of massive footprints leading nowhere. Some people think it's a myth, a figment of the imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what we heard. If you ever find yourself in those woods and hear a roar in the night, don't wait to see what's making it. Leave everything behind and run. Because some things in the forest aren't meant to be understood. And they're definitely not meant to be found. Story number 2. The lights and Bigfoot of Mount St. Helens. When you think of Mount St. Helens, you think of the eruption, smoke and ash swallowing the sky, rivers of molten earth carving paths of destruction. But when my friends and I planned a camping trip there, it wasn't the volcano we were interested in. It was the legends, the whispers of strange lights, eerie encounters, and sightings of something huge, something impossible. None of us really believed in Bigfoot, but that didn't stop us from joking about it as we packed our gear and headed into the forest. By the end of the trip, though, none of us would be laughing, because some legends, I've learned, are real. It was a warm summer weekend when we arrived at Mount St. Helens. The drive up was stunning, lush forests blanketing the slopes, the towering peak rising above us, scarred yet majestic. Our campsite was several miles off the beaten path, a secluded spot near the edge of the forest with a perfect view of the mountain. We wanted isolation, and we got it. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and volcanic rock. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around sharing ghost stories as the stars came out. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. We were still sitting by the fire when Sarah, my best friend, froze mid-sentence. "Did you see that?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "See what?" I asked, looking where she was pointing. "There," she said, her voice trembling. "That light." First, I didn't see anything, but then it appeared, a faint, bluish glow, moving slowly through the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp. It was dim, barely visible, but unmistakably unnatural. "What the hell is that?" Jake, our other friend, whispered. None of us had an answer. The light moved through the forest, flickering and weaving like it was alive. We stood there, frozen, watching it. Then it stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. And then we heard the sound, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder, came from the direction of the light. But there was no way it could have come from any animal I'd ever heard before. "Maybe it's a bear," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't glow," Sarah snapped. Before we could decide what to do, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. For a moment, we stood there in silence, our flashlights cutting through the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Then the growl came again, closer this time. We backed toward the fire, our eyes scanning the tree line. That's when we saw it. It stepped out from the shadows, a massive figure that seemed to blot out the moonlight. It was tall, easily 9 or 10 feet, with broad shoulders and long, muscular arms that hung low at its sides. His body was covered in dark, matted hair, but its eyes were what terrified me the most. They glowed a deep, menacing red, like embers burning in a dying fire. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching us, its chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Then it took a step forward, the ground seeming to tremble beneath its weight. "Run," Sarah whispered, but none of us moved. We were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Then it roared. The sound was deafening, primal, guttural scream that seemed to shake the very air around us. It was a sound of rage, of warning, a sound that made it clear we were not welcome here. That broke the spell. We turned and ran, the firelight flickering behind us as we stumbled through the darkness. The forest blurred around me, branches scratching at my arms and face as I ran. I didn't dare look back. When we reached the car, we threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors and locking them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, away from the campsite, away from whatever we'd just seen. None of us spoke during the drive. The silence in the car was heavy, suffocating. It wasn't until we reached the safety of a motel hours later that any of us dared to break it. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally asked, his voice trembling. "Bigfoot," Sarah said. "It had to be. What else could it have been?" None of us had an answer. The next morning, against my better judgment, we decided to go back. I needed to see the campsite in the daylight, to convince myself that what we'd seen was real, that it hadn't just been some shared hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. The campsite was eerily quiet when we arrived. The fire had burned down to ashes, and our tents were still standing, but everything else was in disarray. Our gear was scattered, some of it torn or broken, and the ground was littered with branches that had been snapped clean in half. And then there were the footprints. They were massive, far larger than any human or animal could make, pressed deep into the soft earth. Each print was perfectly defined, the toes splayed wide, the impression so deep it was as if the ground had been stomped by something impossibly heavy. The smell lingered, too a pungent, musky odor that made my stomach churn. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leave," Jake said. "We leave, and we don't come back." We packed up what little we could salvage and left, driving away from the mountain as fast as we could. I haven't been back to Mount St. Helens since, and I don't plan to. Whatever's out there is not something I ever want to see again. I've read about the stories about the lights, the sightings of Bigfoot, the eerie encounters deep in the forest. Some people think it's a myth, a story to scare campers and hikers. But I know what we saw. I know it was real. If you ever find yourself near Mount St. Helens and see strange lights in the forest, don't follow them. And if you hear the roar, run. Story number 3. The giant shadow in Capital State Forest. Some places feel alive, and not in the way you want them to. Capital State Forest is one of those places. It breathes, it watches, and it waits. I didn't believe in things like that before, but after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever go back. It started as a simple camping trip. Me, my girlfriend Megan, and our two friends, Tyler and Jess, thought we'd spend a weekend away from the city, Capital State Forest, with its dense trees and winding trails. Seemed perfect. It was remote, quiet, and we wouldn't have to worry about anyone else ruining the peace. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the towering trees as we wound our way up a narrow dirt road. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and moss, the kind of earthy scent that makes you feel like you're stepping into another world. By the time we found a spot to set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, roasted hot dogs, and laughed about stupid things like we always did. The forest around us was alive with sound, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl. Felt safe, but that safety was an illusion. The second night was different. It started with the stillness. The forest, which had been so full of life, went silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating quiet that pressed against my ears. Megan noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Tyler said, looking up from the fire. "Exactly," Megan said, her eyes darting to the trees. "It's too quiet." We all fell silent, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of our own breathing. Then came the feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck, like you're being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the darkness beyond the firelight was impenetrable, the trees towering like silent sentinels. "Probably just a bear," Tyler said, trying to sound casual, but his voice wavered, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. We tried to shake it off, returning to our conversation, but the unease lingered. Megan sat closer to me, her hand gripping mine tightly, and Jess kept glancing at the trees, her face pale in the firelight. And then we saw it. First, it was just a shadow, a massive shape standing at the edge of the clearing. I thought it was a tree, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It stepped forward, its massive frame coming into the faint glow of the firelight. It was enormous, easily over 9 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark brown fur that seemed to blend into the shadows. Its shoulders were broad, its arms long, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in claws that hung at its sides. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They were dark, cold, and intelligent, like they were measuring us, deciding what to do. "Holy shit," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. The firelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across its face. Its features were rough, almost human, but not quite. Its presence was overwhelming, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay still," I said, though I wasn't sure why. Something about the way it stood there, unmoving, made me feel like any sudden movement might provoke it. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching, his presence suffocating. Then, slowly, turned, took one massive step back into the trees, then another, its movements impossibly smooth for something so large. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. We sat there in stunned silence, the fire crackling quietly in the stillness. No one spoke, no one moved. It wasn't until the sounds of the forest slowly returned, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, that we finally exhaled. "What the hell was that?" Megan whispered, her voice shaking. Bigfoot, Tyler said, his face pale. It had to be. We didn't sleep that night. We huddled together in the tent, too afraid to step outside. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept picturing those eyes, dark and unblinking, staring into my soul. When dawn finally broke, we emerged cautiously, the morning light casting long shadows across the clearing. The fire had burned out, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke curling into the air. But the ground told the story. Massive footprints, each one easily twice the size of my own, led from the edge of the clearing to the spot where the creature had stood. The impressions were deep, the toes clearly defined in the damp soil. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. "We need to leave," Jess said, her voice trembling. No one argued. We packed up in silence, shoving our gear into our bags and abandoning the things we didn't need. The hike back to the car was tense, every step filled with the fear that it might return. But the forest remained quiet, the shadows unmoving. By the time we reached the car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as we loaded our gear and climbed in, I glanced back at the forest one last time, and that's when I saw it. Standing on a hill, partially hidden by the trees, was the creature. Its massive frame was silhouetted against the morning light. Its dark eyes locked onto ours. It didn't move, didn't follow. It just watched as we drove away. We didn't talk about what happened, not for a long time. Megan refuses to camp anymore, and Tyler won't even go hiking. As for me, I've tried to put it out of my mind, to convince myself it was just a bear or a trick of the light. But deep down, I know better. Some places aren't meant for us. The Capital State Forest belongs to something older, something bigger. And if you ever find yourself there, and you feel like you're being watched, do yourself a favor. Don't look back. Story number 4. The giant footprints at Mount Rainier. I'd always thought of Mount Rainier as a place of serenity, a place where you could lose yourself in the towering trees, the crisp mountain air, and the sheer immensity of nature. It was never a place I associated with fear, but that was before the trip, before the footprints, before it. My boyfriend, Alex, and I had been planning the camping trip for months. The idea was simple, a weekend at Mount Rainier, just the two of us, unplugged and immersed in the wilderness. We'd heard about the beauty of Reflection Lake, with its glassy waters perfectly mirroring the snow-capped peak. It sounded idyllic. We arrived late Friday afternoon, parking at a trailhead and hiking a few miles to a secluded spot near the lake. The hike was beautiful, sunlight filtering through the trees, birds chirping, the distant sound of water rushing over rocks. It was the kind of place that made you feel small in the best way. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat watching the stars come out. Everything was perfect, until the next morning. I woke just after dawn, the chill of the mountain air biting through my sleeping bag. Alex was already up, crouched by the fire pit, poking at the embers from the night before. "I'm going to get some water," I said, grabbing the collapsible bucket. The lake was just a short walk from our campsite, and I figured the brisk air would wake me up. The ground was soft from a recent rain, the smell of damp earth filling my lungs as I approached the water. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own feet, pressed deep into the muddy ground. Each step was perfectly defined, the toes splayed wide, the impressions so deep they seemed to defy logic. Whatever had made them was heavy, very heavy. "Alex," I called, my voice echoing off the trees. He jogged over, his brow furrowing as he saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the footprints. "Look." His eyes widened as he crouched to examine them. "What the hell?" We followed the trail of prints along the edge of the lake, our curiosity overpowering the unease creeping into my gut. The footprints continued into the forest, each step spaced unnaturally far apart, as if whatever had made them had an enormous stride. Maybe it's a bear, Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. Bears don't have feet like this, I replied, my stomach tightening. The farther we went, the stronger the smell became, a rank, pungent stench that filled the air, like a mix of rotting meat and animal waste. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Do you smell that? Alex asked, his face pale. I nodded, my eyes watering from the odor. What is that? The trail led us to a small clearing, the ground littered with broken branches and tufts of fur. The smell was nearly unbearable now, thick and cloying. Something had been here recently, and whatever it was big. We should go back, I said, my voice shaking. Alex nodded, but before we could move, a sound froze us in place. A growl. It was deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, like the rumble of distant thunder, came from behind us, sending a shockwave of fear through my body. We turned slowly, and there it was. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. First, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was tall, easily over 8 feet, and covered in matted, dark hair. The shoulders were broad, its chest heaving as it breathed. But it was the face that terrified me the most. Its eyes were deep-set, glowing faintly in the shadows, and its expression was cold, almost calculating. Alex, I whispered, clutching his arm. We need to go. He didn't respond. He was frozen, his eyes locked on the creature. For a moment, none of us moved. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then it took a step forward. The ground shook slightly under its weight, and I felt my knees go weak. The creature growled again, baring teeth that were too human, too wrong. Its eyes flicked between us, as if deciding whether we were worth the effort. Run, Alex whispered. We turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the smell of the creature still clinging to the air. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind us, breaking branches and rustling leaves. It was following us. The forest blurred as we ran, the trees closing in around us. My lungs burned, my legs screaming for relief, but I didn't stop. The growls grew fainter, and then, suddenly, they stopped. We stumbled into the trailhead clearing, gasping for breath. I turned, expecting to see it burst from the trees, but there was nothing, just silence. Alex grabbed my arm. We're leaving, now. We didn't talk much on the drive home. The fear lingered, a tangible presence that neither of us could shake. I kept expecting to see the creature in the rearview mirror, its glowing eyes watching us leave. Since that trip, I've read about the stories of Mount Rainier, the sightings, the footprints, the sounds. Some people call it Bigfoot. Others think it's something else, something older. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't just an animal. There was something in its eyes, something intelligent, something dangerous. If you ever find yourself near Reflection Lake and see footprints that shouldn't be there, don't follow them, because whatever made them is still out there, and it's watching. Story number 5. The eyes in the dark at Diablo Lake. Diablo Lake is the kind of place you'd think was too beautiful to be haunted. The water is a surreal shade of green, like a liquid gemstone, surrounded by towering mountains and dense forests. It looks like something out of a postcard, a place where you'd come to find peace. That's what we thought. Anyway, but we were wrong. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when it's quiet and dark, and I can feel the weight of something watching. It's hard to explain what happened without sounding crazy, but I'll try. You can believe me or not, but I swear to you every word is true. It was late September when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend at Diablo Lake. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend Emily, and our friends Matt and Jenna. We'd planned the trip as a last hurrah before the cold weather set in, a chance to disconnect and spend a few days in nature. The drive out was long but beautiful, the highway winding through the North Cascades, with jagged peaks looming on either side. By the time we reached the campground, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting everything in a golden glow. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. We set up camp at a spot near the edge of the lake, with a clear view of the water and the mountains beyond. It was perfect, the kind of place that makes you forget about work, traffic, and the endless noise of modern life. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, we lit a fire and settled in for the evening. That first night was uneventful. We roasted marshmallows, shared stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. The forest around us felt alive, full of the sounds of rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and the occasional splash of water as a fish broke the surface. Felt safe. But the next night was different. Started around midnight. We were sitting around the fire, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. Matt was in the middle of telling a story about a supposed Bigfoot sighting near Mount Rainier, his voice low and dramatic, when Jenna suddenly went quiet. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her eyes darting to the trees behind us. We all stopped talking, the laughter dying in our throats. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft lapping of water against the shore. "Hear what?" Matt asked. Jenna shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I don't know. I thought I heard something, like footsteps." Emily leaned closer to me, her hand gripping mine. "It's probably just an animal," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. But then we heard it, a low, deliberate crunch, like something heavy stepping on dry leaves. It was faint, coming from somewhere deep in the trees, but it was there. Matt grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the silence, heavy and oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Matt turned back to us, forcing a grin. Probably a deer or something, but we all knew it wasn't a deer. We tried to shake it off, returning to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. The fire felt smaller, the night darker. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale. Jenna wouldn't stop fidgeting, her eyes darting to the trees. And then we saw it. It started with the eyes, two glowing red orbs, staring at us from the darkness. They were far apart, higher than they should have been, like they belonged to something much larger than a human. They didn't blink, didn't move, they just stared. "What the hell is that?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the trees. The beam caught something, a shape, massive and covered in thick, gray fur. It was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, his body blending into the shadows. But its eyes burned like embers, unblinking and cold. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. Emily let out a soft whimper, her grip on my hand tightening. "Should we do something?" Jenna whispered. "Like what?" I hissed. "It's not exactly a raccoon." Matt raised his flashlight, aiming it at the creature's face. For a moment, I thought it might charge, but it didn't. Instead, tilted its head, as if studying us. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across its face. Its features were vaguely human, but its proportions were all wrong, too large, too wide, too alien. And then it moved, turned slowly, its massive shoulders rippling under its fur, and began to walk away, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. It didn't run. It didn't seem scared. It just disappeared into the trees, leaving only silence in its wake. We sat there for a long moment, too stunned to speak. Then Jenna stood, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." No one argued. We doused the fire, grabbed our things, and packed up in record time. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But the trees were still, the darkness unbroken. The drive home was quiet, the four of us too shaken to talk. It wasn't until we reached the city that Matt finally broke the silence. "You saw it, right?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not crazy?" None of us answered. We didn't have to. We all knew what we'd seen. It's been months since that night, but it still haunts me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those glowing red eyes, feel the weight of its gaze. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to. All I know is that Diablo Lake isn't as peaceful as it seems. If you ever find yourself out there, sitting by a fire and staring into the trees, do yourself a favor. Don't look too long. And if you see the eyes, don't shine a light on them. Story number 6. The encounter in Snoqualmie Forest. The Snoqualmie Forest has a way of making you feel small. The towering trees, the thick mist that clings to the ground like a shroud, the eerie quiet. It's a place that seems untouched by time, a world unto itself. My family and I thought it would be the perfect spot for a weekend camping trip. A chance to disconnect, to breathe fresh air, to just be together. We had no idea what we were walking into. It was early October, the air crisp and cool, the leaves just starting to turn. My wife, Linda, and I had packed up the SUV with all the essentials. The tent, sleeping bags, food for 3 days, and enough gear to satisfy our kids, Sam and Ellie, both of whom had recently discovered the joys of Esmores. The drive out was uneventful, winding through narrow mountain roads, the kind that made you feel like you were heading deeper and deeper into nowhere. We reached the trailhead in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees. The forest was beautiful, the kind of beauty that takes your breath away. The towering firs and cedars seemed to stretch endlessly into the misty sky. Their branches tangled like fingers reaching for something unseen. Felt peaceful, at least. First, the hike to our campsite took about an hour, the trail winding through dense underbrush and along the edge of a small ridge. The kids loved it, bounding ahead with the kind of energy only kids have, while Linda and I followed at a slower pace, enjoying the sound of birdsong and the faint rustle of leaves. By the time we set up camp, the sun had disappeared, leaving the forest bathed in a soft, silvery glow. The mist was thicker now, curling around the trees and creeping into the clearing where we'd pitched our tent. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and spent the evening laughing and telling stories. The kids roasted marshmallows, their faces lit by the flickering flames. It felt perfect, like something out of a storybook. But the forest had other plans. Started around midnight. I was sitting by the dying fire, staring into the embers, when I heard it, a low rumble, like distant thunder. First, I thought it was just my imagination, the kind of noise your mind invents when you're surrounded by so much silence. But then it came again, louder this time, a sound that wasn't thunder at all. It was the sound of rocks tumbling. I stood, my ears straining to pinpoint the source. The noise was coming from the ridge above us, where the trail disappeared into the trees. Linda stirred in her sleeping bag, her face pale in the firelight. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Stay here," grabbing the flashlight. I made my way toward the edge of the clearing, the beam cutting through the mist. The noise had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I shined the light up the hill, but the beam seemed to vanish into the fog, swallowed whole by the darkness. And then I saw it. First, it was just a shape, a massive shadow standing motionless among the trees. My brain struggled to make sense of it, to fit it into something familiar, but it didn't fit. It was too big, too still, too wrong. "Dad!" Sam's voice broke through my thoughts, small and trembling. "Get back to the tent," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. The shape moved, took a step forward, and my breath caught in my throat. The figure was enormous, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, its shoulders broad, its arms hanging low at its sides. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, the color impossible to discern in the dim light. But its eyes burned red, like coals smoldering in the darkness. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The creature stood there, staring at me, his head tilting slightly, as if studying me. For a moment, everything was silent, and then it let out a sound, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I ran. I don't remember reaching the tent, but suddenly I was there, my hands fumbling with the zipper. Inside, I shouted, shoving the kids and Linda into the tent. We zipped it shut and huddled together, the only light coming from the flashlight I'd left on the ground outside. The growling grew louder, closer, and then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, each one sending vibrations through the ground. I held my breath, praying it would pass, that it would lose interest and move on. But it didn't. The tent fabric shifted, the shadow of the creature looming over us. His breathing was loud, rasping, the sound of something ancient and powerful. And then it roared, a sound so loud and primal it made my ears ring. The kids clung to Linda, their faces buried in her chest, and I grabbed the only weapon I had, a camping knife. Small and useless, but the creature didn't attack. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, his shadow motionless, his presence suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The growling faded, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps retreating into the forest. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't even move. We stayed huddled together in the tent, too afraid to step outside. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the faint rustle of leaves. When dawn finally broke, we emerged cautiously, the mist still clinging to the trees. The clearing was empty, the forest quiet, but the ground told a different story. Massive footprints, each one at least twice the size of my own, led from the ridge to our tent and then disappeared into the trees. We packed up quickly, abandoning half our gear in our rush to leave. The hike back to the car was tense, every snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through me. But the creature didn't return. By the time we reached the car, the sun was high in the sky, and the forest felt almost normal again. Almost. We never talked about what happened, not really. The kids still have nightmares sometimes, and Linda refuses to go camping anymore. As for me, I've tried to forget, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or a bad dream. But I can't forget those eyes. If you ever find yourself in Snoqualmie Forest, and you hear rocks tumbling in the distance, do yourself a favor. Don't investigate. Don't look for answers. Just leave, because sometimes the forest doesn't want you there. Story number 7. The chase at Mount Baker. I've always loved the outdoors, the stillness of the mountains, the way the stars look so much brighter without the glow of city lights. But after what happened on Mount Baker, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in the wilderness again. There's something out there, something bigger and older than us, and it doesn't like being disturbed. It was late October when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend camping on the slopes of Mount Baker. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend Claire, and our friends Josh and Anna. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, eager to escape the grind of work and spend a few days surrounded by nature. The hike to our campsite was beautiful, thick forests of fir and cedar, their trunks rising like ancient pillars, the air cool and sharp with the scent of pine. We found a clearing about 5 miles up the trail, with a stunning view of the mountain and the valley below. Felt perfect, like a postcard come to life. By the time we set up camp, the sun was sinking low, bathing everything in a warm golden light. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and spent the evening laughing and sharing stories. The forest around us felt alive, full of the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, in the way only a place like that can be. But peace doesn't last forever. Started just after midnight. We were sitting around the fire, the flames crackling in the cold night air, when we heard it, a low, mournful howl, echoing through the trees. It was faint at first, so far away it could have been the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, and closer. Wolves? Josh asked, his voice low. Maybe, Anna said, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. It doesn't sound like wolves. It's different. And it was. The sound was deeper, almost guttural, with a sharp edge that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't just echo through the forest. It seemed to vibrate in my chest, like the growl of some massive, unseen predator. "Let's not freak ourselves out," Claire said, though her hand tightened on mine. "It's probably just an animal." "Yeah," Josh said, forcing a laugh. "An animal that sounds like it's 10 feet tall." We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. The fire suddenly felt small, its light barely reaching the edge of the clearing. The shadows beyond seemed to press in closer, darker and deeper than before. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They were slow at first, like something massive was moving carefully through the trees. Then they stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. "Hello," Josh called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Josh grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. It caught the edge of a tree trunk, the branches above swaying slightly in the cold breeze. And then it hit. The tree shuddered violently as something slammed into it, a loud, deafening crack that echoed through the clearing. Claire screamed, grabbing my arm, and Josh stumbled backward, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. "What the hell was that?" Anna whispered, her face pale. Before anyone could answer, they stepped into the firelight. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, its shoulders broad and covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light. Its face was vaguely human, but twisted, with deep-set eyes that burned red like embers. Its arms were long, ending in hands or claws that hung low at its sides, and it just stood there, staring at us. Claire was trembling, her breath coming in short gasps. What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But we need to leave. Now." The creature let out a sound, a deep, guttural roar that shook the ground beneath our feet. Took a step forward, its massive feet crunching through the underbrush, and we ran. I don't remember much about that sprint through the forest, just the sound of my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart, and the deafening roar of the creature behind us. The trees blurred into a dark, twisting maze, the flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks. At one point, I glanced back and saw it charging after us, its massive frame moving with a terrifying speed that didn't seem possible for something so big. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, burning with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Faster!" Josh shouted, his voice hoarse. "It's gaining on us." We pushed ourselves harder, the fear giving us strength we didn't know we had. The path ahead seemed endless, the trees pressing in on either side. But then, finally, we saw it, the faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting off the car's windows. We burst into the clearing, stumbling and gasping for breath. Josh fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, and Josh started the engine, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. As we sped down the narrow road, I looked back and saw it standing at the edge of the clearing. Its massive frame was silhouetted against the moonlight, its red eyes glowing as it watched us go. It didn't move, didn't follow. It just stood there, its presence lingering in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. We didn't stop driving until we reached the highway, the forest a dark blur in the rearview mirror. None of us spoke, the silence in the car as heavy as the one we'd left behind. When we finally reached town, Josh pulled over, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "What the hell was that thing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us had an answer. That was a year ago, and I haven't been back to Mount Baker since. None of us have. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I can still hear it, the howl, long and mournful, echoing through the darkness. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what we saw that night, Maybe it was Bigfoot. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that the forest isn't as empty as we think it is. And if you ever hear a howl in the dark, do yourself a favor. Don't stick around to see what's making it. Story number 8. Terror in the Cascades. Camping in the Cascades had always been on my bucket list. I'd read about the endless beauty of the North Cascades National Park, its rugged peaks, hidden waterfalls, and remote streams that made you feel like the last person on Earth. When my friends Max and Rachel invited me on a weekend trip, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like the perfect way to escape the city and reconnect with nature. Looking back, I wish I'd never said yes. The drive into the park was breathtaking. The mountains loomed high above us, their snow-capped peaks glowing in the late afternoon light. We parked at a remote trailhead and hiked several miles into the wilderness, our gear bouncing on our backs as we joked and laughed. Rachel, the most experienced hiker among us, led the way, her confidence easing any nerves Max and I might have felt about being so far from civilization. We set up camp by a secluded stream, its crystal clear water gurgling softly over smooth rocks. The surrounding forest was dense, the trees towering so high that only slivers of sunlight reached the ground. It felt untouched, ancient. It was the kind of place that made you forget the modern world existed. As night fell, the forest came alive with sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional splash of a fish in the stream. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and shared ghost stories under the stars. The night was calm, almost magical, until it wasn't. It was sometime after midnight when I woke to a sound. First, I thought it was the stream, but as I lay there, I realized it was something else entirely. A low, rhythmic thud-thud, like the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the forest. "Max," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" "Listen." We both sat in silence, the sound growing louder. It wasn't just footsteps. There was a cracking, splintering noise, like trees being pushed aside or broken. Rachel unzipped her tent and stuck her head out. "What the hell is that?" she asked, her voice low but tense. "I don't know," I said, my stomach tightening. "But it's getting closer." The sounds grew louder, accompanied by the occasional whomp of something massive hitting the ground. It was as if the forest itself was being torn apart. "We need to see what it is," Max said, grabbing his flashlight. "Are you insane?" Rachel hissed. "We stay in the tents. Whatever it is, it'll leave." But Max was already unzipping his tent. "What if it doesn't?" Reluctantly, Rachel and I followed him out, our flashlights slicing through the darkness. The forest around us was unnervingly still, the usual sounds of the night replaced by an oppressive silence. And then we saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. First, I thought it was just a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else, something alive. The creature was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and muscular frame dwarfing even the tallest man. His body was covered in dark, matted hair, and its eyes glowed an eerie yellow in the light of our flashlights. It stared at us, its expression unreadable, but there was something in its gaze that chilled me to my core. "What the hell is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "Bigfoot," Max muttered, his face pale. Before I could respond, the creature stepped forward, the ground shaking beneath its weight. It bent down, grabbing a massive branch with one hand and snapping it in half as if it were a twig. Then it threw the broken pieces toward us. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The 3 of us bolted, ducking as branches and debris flew past us. The creature let out a guttural roar, the sound so loud it seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I stumbled, nearly falling, but Max grabbed my arm and pulled me back to my feet. We ran until we reached the edge of the stream, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding. For a moment, we thought we'd lost it, but then we heard it again, the thud-thud of its footsteps. Closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. "It's following us," Rachel said, her voice shaking. Max pointed to a rocky outcrop on the other side of the stream. "We can hide there." We waded through the icy water, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. By the time we reached the outcrop, the creature had entered the clearing, its massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight. From our hiding spot, we watched as it sniffed the air, its glowing eyes scanning the area. It let out another roar, a sound so primal and raw it felt like the forest itself was screaming. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, turned and lumbered back into the trees, the sound of its footsteps fading into the distance. We didn't sleep that night. We sat huddled together under the outcrop, jumping at every sound, every rustle of leaves. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, we packed up what little we'd brought with us and made our way back to the trailhead. As we hiked, we passed the clearing where we'd first seen it. The ground was littered with broken branches and deep impressions where its feet had been. The smell lingered too, a pungent, musky odor that made my stomach churn. Since that night, I've thought about the creature every day. I've read the stories, the accounts of other campers and hikers who've seen something similar in the Cascades. Some people believe it's just a legend, a figment of our collective imagination. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. If you ever find yourself in the North Cascades and hear the sound of trees breaking in the night, don't go outside. Don't try to see what it is, because if it sees you, it might not let you go. Story number 9. Encounter in the Olympic Forest. When people talk about the Olympic National Forest, they usually mention its beauty. They talk about the mist-covered trees, the crystal-clear streams, and the feeling of stepping into another world. They don't talk about the silence, or the shadows, or the things that live there. I never thought much about those things either until that night. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me, my girlfriend Lily, and our friends Tom and Rachel had planned it as a way to get away from the grind, to spend a weekend off the grid. Tom had picked the spot deep in the Olympic National Forest, near Mount Storm King. It was remote, secluded, and perfect for what we thought would be a relaxing escape. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, the car packed with tents, coolers, and enough snacks to last a week. The hike to our campsite was longer than we'd expected, the trail winding through dense forest that seemed to close in around us. By the time we reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the trees. The first night was uneventful. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing and sharing stories. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Felt peaceful, safe, but that peace wouldn't last. The next day, we hiked to a nearby overlook, the view of the surrounding mountains breathtaking. Tom and Rachel were in high spirits, snapping pictures and talking about future trips. But Lily seemed uneasy, her eyes constantly darting to the trees. "Do you feel like we're being watched?" she asked me as we stood at the edge of the overlook. I laughed, trying to brush off her concern. "It's just the forest. So quiet. It feels like that sometimes." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't say anything more. That night, everything changed. We were sitting around the fire, the flames crackling in the cool night air. Tom was telling a story about a supposed Bigfoot sighting in the area, his voice low and dramatic. Rachel rolled her eyes, but Lily leaned closer to me, her grip tightening on my arm. "And then," Tom said, his eyes wide, "they saw it huge, covered in black fur, with these glowing red eyes. A branch snapped somewhere behind us, the sound sharp and sudden in the silence. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats. Rachel was the first to speak. "Probably just an animal," she said, though her voice wavered. "Yeah," Tom said, nodding, "probably a deer or something," but I wasn't so sure. The sound hadn't been a rustle or a light step. It had been heavy, deliberate, like something big was moving through the trees. We tried to shake it off, returning to our conversation. But the mood had shifted. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. The fire seemed smaller, its light barely reaching the edges of the clearing. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, like the earth itself was rumbling. It came from somewhere just beyond the firelight. A sound so primal it made my skin crawl. Lily clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What the hell was that?" Rachel whispered, her face pale. Tom grabbed his flashlight, his hand shaking. "I'm gonna check it out." "Are you insane?" I hissed. "Stay by the fire." But Tom was already standing, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The growl came again, louder this time, closer, and then we heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadows beyond the fire seemed to shift, and then we saw it. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, his body covered in thick, black fur that seemed to absorb the light. His shoulders were broad, his arms long, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in claws that glinted in the faint firelight. But it was the eyes that froze me in place, glowing red, like embers, staring at us with a cold, inhuman intensity. Lily let out a strangled gasp, and the thing turned its head toward her, its gaze locking onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. It let out another growl, the sound vibrating through the air, and then it stepped closer, the ground shaking with each heavy footfall. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lily's hand and pulling her toward the tent. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. We scrambled to grab our bags, our hands shaking so badly we could barely work the zippers. The growling grew louder, the footsteps faster, and then the thing let out a scream, a high-pitched, guttural wail that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before, like an animal and a man and something else entirely. We bolted into the trees, the flashlight beams swinging wildly as we ran. The forest seemed alive with sound, the crashing of branches, the pounding of footsteps, the deafening echoes of that scream. I glanced back once and saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, its red eyes burning in the darkness. By the time we reached the car, I was gasping for breath, my chest heaving. Tom fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, and Tom floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the forest a dark blur in the rearview mirror. No one spoke, the silence in the car as heavy as the one we'd left behind. When we finally reached the main road, Rachel let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "What the hell was that thing?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. None of us had an answer. That was 6 months ago. We haven't been back to Olympic National Forest since, and I don't think we ever will. Tom deleted all the pictures he took on the trip, saying he didn't want any reminders. Lily still wakes up in the middle of the night, clutching at me, her breath ragged, and sometimes, when it's quiet, I think I can still hear that scream. I don't know what we saw that night. Maybe it was Bigfoot, maybe it was something else. But I do know one thing, there are places in this world that don't belong to us. Places where the shadows move, and the trees whisper, and the things that live their watch. And if you ever find yourself deep in the Olympic forest, and you hear a growl in the dark, do yourself a favor. Don't look back. Story number 10. Bigfoot's fury in the Yakama forest. Camping in the Yakama forest had been my friend Eric's idea. He was the outdoorsy one of our group, the guy who always had a new trail to explore or a hidden campsite to discover. When he suggested a weekend in one of the Pacific Northwest's most remote and mysterious forests, none of us hesitated. The Yakama forest, after all, was legendary for its beauty and its stories. The tales about Bigfoot were what drew us in. Eric laughed them off, dismissing them as local folklore. But there was a thrill in knowing we were venturing into territory where countless people had claimed to see something unexplainable. What we didn't know was that we were about to join their ranks. It was late Friday afternoon when we reached the forest. The drive had taken hours, winding through dense, towering trees that seemed to close in the deeper we went. By the time we reached the secluded spot Eric had picked, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The campsite was beautiful, isolated, and quiet, with a small clearing surrounded by massive evergreens. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and settled in for a night under the stars. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and moss. For a while, it was perfect, but as the night deepened, the forest began to change. It started with the sounds. We were sitting around the fire, sharing beers and laughing about our week, when a sharp crack echoed through the trees. We froze, our laughter dying instantly. Probably just a branch falling, Eric said, though his voice was lower than usual. Then came another crack, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the forest. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, each one accompanied by the rustle of branches and the occasional snap of undergrowth. "Deer," Sarah, my girlfriend, suggested, though she sounded anything but confident. "No deer is that heavy," Eric said, standing and shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows and mist. For a moment, everything was still. Then we heard it, a scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something primal, guttural, and loud enough to make the ground seem to vibrate beneath us. The firelight flickered as if responding to the sound, and a wave of cold air swept through the clearing. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Eric didn't answer. He was staring into the trees, his face pale. "Let's just get in the tents," he said finally. "It's probably nothing." I don't know how long I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The footsteps came and went, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough that I thought I could feel the vibration through the ground. Sarah was curled up next to me, her breathing shallow and quick. Then, without warning, something hit the side of our tent. It wasn't a branch or a pine cone. It was hard, deliberate, and heavy, leaving a deep indentation in the fabric. I grabbed Sarah's arm, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Before she could answer, the tent was hit again, this time with enough force to send us scrambling backward. "Eric!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Eric, are you out there?" There was no response, just silence, thick and suffocating. And then the tent collapsed. We scrambled out, blinded by the sudden cold and darkness. My flashlight flickered to life, the beam sweeping across the campsite. The fire was out. Eric's tent was torn open, the fabric hanging in shreds. His gear was scattered across the clearing, some of it crushed, some of it missing. Sarah grabbed my arm, pointing toward the trees. It was there, Bigfoot. The creature was massive, easily over 9 feet tall, his frame impossibly broad. His body was covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb the light, and its glowing eyes burned with an intensity that made my stomach churn. It stood near the remains of Eric's tent, holding a piece of fabric in one massive hand. It stared at us, its expression unreadable but somehow filled with menace. Then it stepped forward, its footfall so heavy I could feel it in my chest. It raised its head and let out another scream, louder and more piercing than the first. "Run!" Eric's voice came from somewhere behind us, but I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we ran. The sound of trees snapping and branches breaking followed us, along with that terrible, guttural roar. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, the creature's presence looming behind us like a shadow. When we finally reached the car, Eric was already there, fumbling with the keys, We threw ourselves inside, locking the doors as if that would keep it out. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then the car shook. The creature slammed its hand against the rear window, the glass spiderwebbing under the force. Its glowing eyes stared at us through the shattered pane, and for a moment, I thought it would tear the car apart. But then it stopped. It stood there, breathing heavily, before turning and disappearing into the forest. We didn't speak on the drive back. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the occasional gasp for breath. When we finally reached a gas station hours later, we sat in the parking lot for what felt like forever, trying to process what had happened. The next morning, Eric wanted to go back for the gear we'd left behind. Sarah and I refused, but he was insistent. He needed to know if it was real. He returned hours later, pale and shaking. The campsite was destroyed. Our tents had been shredded, and our gear was scattered. The ground was littered with massive footprints, each one perfectly defined, each one larger than any human foot could ever be. The smell lingered, too a pungent, musky odor that made him gag. "I don't know what it was," he said, his voice trembling, "but it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. I haven't been back to the Yakama forest since that night, and I don't plan to. The stories of Bigfoot, of the roars, the broken trees, the glowing eyes are no longer just stories to me. They're warnings. If you ever find yourself in those woods and hear a scream in the night, don't wait to see what's making it. Run, because some legends are real." Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through Washington's haunted forests and terrifying Bigfoot encounters. From the glowing eyes at Diablo Lake to the eerie roars of Gifford Pinchot Forest, these stories remind us that the wilderness holds secrets that defy explanation. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, in the woods, you might not be alone.